see it to believe it. So last week, we started a series called The Faith of Trees, kind of a different idea. And we're thinking about spiritual analogies to the life and seasons of trees. We started with true colors last week, remembering how trees, when their leaves start to turn, reflect the fact that they're under stress. Their food source is diminishing, and yet they create beauty. And for all of us, stress reveals true colors, but as trees point out, they can produce beauty. They can reveal color and beauty in our lives. Today we go to the next stage in the cycle of trees, and that's when the leaves start to fall, when the leaves begin to drop. It's actually nature's best self-preservation act, because the leaves fall into the soil and they become reproductive to create things that nourish and add to life. The Nature Conservancy points out a number of things that trees do when they drop leaves that are helpful. Falling leaves are helpful in this way. It enriches soil with nutrients, provides a habitat for insects and other pollinators in the wintertime, mitigates a climate change by storing carbon, and reduces air and water pollution. So if you get nothing else out of the sermon, then know that this fall, if you just don't feel like raking leaves, you're contributing to the environment. So you're doing something very helpful. That's a free tip for you there. Trees remind us that they leave behind a helpful influence. What do you leave behind? I know. But it's an important thought. Environmentalists tell us that we all have a carbon footprint. We leave things that, without necessarily intending to, do harm to the environment. Even by breathing itself, we exhale carbon dioxide that can be harmful to the planet. But trees breathe in carbon dioxide, so the trees have our backs, and we need the trees to stick around. Now, you add to this the other things that we do, like water usage, disposal of plastics, garbage production, fossil fuels, and we all leave quite a carbon footprint. Now, the sermon today is not about climate change, but I do want to use this opportunity to point out what a team within St. Luke's does to help us in this matter. We have a creation care team that works really hard to help us live out our first act of stewardship, which is to be caretakers of the earth. And so they are always working on things, many times providing educational material for us, but now they're doing things like working with our building committee to look at putting solar panels on our new buildings, the storage building at the end of the parking lot, and perhaps other buildings on the campus. We just approved a statement that they prepared for St. Luke's at our recent governing board meeting called the Carbon Neutrality Strategic Plan. This is their effort to meet one of the goals that was passed at General Conference last year, to be net zero in emissions and be carbon neutral for United Methodist congregations by 2050. Now, that's a very significant, aggressive goal, but this team is preparing a paper now that we've approved as a church to look at what we have to do to start doing this. 4 years ago, our boards and agencies created a statement called our Climate Commitment to Net Zero Emissions. In it, it said, the United Methodist Church has long affirmed our individual and collective responsibility to address the unfolding climate crisis. In light of these values, the group said it was called by our faith, informed by science, and led by our relationships with impacted communities to respond urgently. So our United Methodist Church wants us to not have a negative influence on the world. But like I said, we're not talking in this sermon about our physical influence. I want us to think today about the influences we leave that are more spiritual and emotional. Whether we intend to or not, whether we mean to, we are leaving constantly an influence that's either positive or negative. And what trees remind us is that we're made to leave behind something good. What do you leave behind? How can we have the faith of trees? I want to think about one word Paul uses in his letter to the Philippians. The word captures Paul's reasons for writing the letter, which basically were twofold. Paul wrote to the Philippians to say thank you. He was in prison when he wrote, most likely Caesarea, where he was in prison for 2 years, waiting for a verdict from the prefect. While he was in prison there, the Philippians wrote to Paul, worried about him. Paul, we're concerned. How are you doing? What's your state of mind? How's your spirit? Are you doing okay, Paul? They didn't just send him greetings, they sent him gifts. And Paul is so grateful for this congregation and their love. And when he writes to them after the initial salutation, his opening line in the letter is, I thank my God every time I remember you. It is a love letter, a letter from a pastor to a congregation saying, thank you. Thank you for who you are. But the other purpose of the letter is to encourage the Philippians to keep doing what they've always been doing. Keep showing compassion. Keep showing grace and kindness and mercy to people. He calls this having the mind of Christ, who Paul said did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Think about that word grasp. What do you have to do to grasp something? Do this, right? Put your hand up. Grasp something. Grasp it. Feel yourself grasping. Feel yourself grasping for the things our word grasp. Christ did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. What do you have to do when you empty yourself? You got to hold your hand open. Paul says this is our model. Jesus who emptied himself. He didn't try to grab onto things. And when he gets toward the end of the letter, he encourages them. He says, therefore, my brothers and sisters whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, my beloved. It's a love letter. And when he says, stand firm in this way, 2 sentences later, he explains what this way means. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. It's a curious phrase. Paul doesn't say, let your power be known. He doesn't say, let your strength be known. Let your authority be known. He says, let your gentleness be known. I wonder if that would have been a countercultural word to the Philippians in the first century. I wonder how countercultural it is today. Back in the 1970s, there was a guy named Robert Ringer who, after 5 years at Ohio State University, finally gave up trying to get a degree and he dropped out of school. He didn't know what to do. A friend was listening to him moan about this one day and said, well, you write good letters, why don't you write something? So he wrote a book. It was rejected by 23 publishers. So somehow he came up with the money to publish it himself. It made the New York Times bestseller list. The title, Winning Through Intimidation. It was number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 36 weeks. One of the most dominant runs in the history of the New York Times list. So after that success, he had to come out with another book. He titled this one, To Be or Not to Be Intimidated. That's the question. Guess what? It was the same book. He just put a different title on it. Because he wanted people to know that the purpose of the first book was not about how to intimidate people. It was how to deal with people who are so intimidating. Except this book didn't even make the New York Times bestseller list. So he went back to work. He started writing other books. His next book that came out, Looking Out for Number One. 22 weeks, number one, New York Times bestseller list. And he published book after that along the similar lines because Robert Ringer figured out what Americans are willing to buy. His third best-selling book, Restoring the American Dream. Are statements like that still reflective of American values? If so, how countercultural is Paul's advice for us? Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The word gentleness has been a confusing word for translators for many, many, many years. William Barclay says it's one of the most untranslatable of all Greek words. It's only used one other time in the New Testament, in Paul's letter to the first letter to the Corinthians. Scholars, when they can't identify what a word means, they look for it in other places in the culture. They couldn't find it anywhere. Now, some of you are saying, wait a minute, Rob, we started this year with a series on the fruit of the Spirit. And didn't you preach a sermon where Paul wrote in Galatians, the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness? I did, except the Greek word there is praus. Praus is like the reins of a horse. And what it means is strength under control. What gentleness means with that idea, and the way that it gets used in the rest of the New Testament, is restrain yourself from doing harm. That's what gentleness means. Restrain yourself from doing harm. But this is not the same word. This word is epikes. Epikes. Combination of two words, the prefix epi, meaning on, and ikos, meaning fitting or reasonable. In other words, epikes is talking about something that's very fitting. About the nearest analogy you can find for using this word is like a judge in a courtroom who is giving a sentence for an offense. And the law would say that for every kind of a crime or an offense, this is the reasonable punishment that a person should pay. But a judge might not do that. A judge might say, yeah, but I'm going to take into account the circumstances in which this person committed the offense. I'm going to take into account what this person needs, the way they were brought up, perhaps, their influences that shaped them. And I'm going to do something more lenient. You might say in Indianapolis, it has to do with a 69-year-old guy who stabbed somebody one night downtown. And you say, well, that's clear. He ought to pay for a crime. Until you realize, no, he was getting the mercy beat out of him by a Fox newscaster and a former football player. That's the nearest football story you're going to get today. But you say, what's the fitting thing to do? The fitting thing is to be lenient, to look at what the person needs and show them the kindness and the mercy that they need. That's epikes. It's more of the positive act that we can contribute that helps somebody. Now, why would Paul tell people who are already showing compassion and mercy for people to remember to keep doing it? Why would he tell people, keep doing this, you're already doing it, but you got to keep doing it? Why would he do that? Because we leak, don't we? Because we can leak. And if we don't keep it before us, other things can begin to happen inside of us, and we lose that mind of Christ. Psychologists teach us about stimulus response theory. Stimulus response theory says that there are stimulators in an environment that affect an organism. And the reactions to that stimulus by an organism causes stimulation. And over time, an organism can be conditioned by the stimulations that go on around it until the organism begins to become that. If that is at all true, what could be happening in our culture right now with the stimulations that are around us all the time of division and arguing and violence and hurt, so constant? What can that begin to do inside of us to cause us to leak our truest identity, to have the mind of Christ, who didn't grasp, who emptied? What causes you to leak gentleness? Here's what causes me to leak gentleness. It's when I put my own wants center stage. Because when my wants take center stage, gentleness becomes a secondary actor. 2 weeks ago, I went to Denver for my grandson's 3rd birthday. Birthday party was Saturday, so that Sunday, the Colts were playing out in Los Angeles. In Denver, I learned that they were not televising the Colts game on the main networks, which I find a little irritating considering how much we show Broncos games here in Indianapolis. So be it. I had to go find one of these sports bars that had like 100 televisions that televised every game and ping pong and badminton. I mean, it got everything going. So I drive 20 minutes to get to this place, and I go in, and the Colts are not on one television screen. Somebody said, well, you have to go up and ask the bartender. So I went up to the bartender and said, can you get the Colts game on a TV? She said, sure. She pulls out an iPad, pressed a few buttons, and bam, right away, 3 of the TVs come up with the Colts game. So I went straight to the nearest TV screen. There's a little table that only seats 2 people. I took my seat. I got the game right there, and I am happy. But now remember, my wants are center stage. Waitress comes, takes my order. And I start looking around and I go, the Colts game over there and back there are bigger TV screens. And they look clearer than this one. This one looks kind of cloudy. And I'm looking at those. So when the waitress brings my order back, I say, could I sit at that table over there or that one back there? And she said, if you go to that table over there, you're going to have to get a different server. And if you go to one of those tables back there, they are much bigger. And, well, you're only one. And she walked off. I didn't like her very much. And probably over our next 3 or 4 interactions, I communicated that. I didn't say anything. I wasn't rude. I wasn't hateful. I was just cool. She probably read, I don't like you. The next morning in my prayer time, the Lord reminded me of that. And the Lord said, you were a jerk yesterday. And I said, well, now, Lord, in my defense. He said, don't give me any in your defense. You were a jerk yesterday. And all because you wanted to watch a football game that the Colts lost anyway. He did not say the Colts lost because of you, but I could hear the Lord thinking it. What he did say was, you don't know this person. She might be a single mom just trying to make ends meet. Her partner might have just walked out on her. She might have a loved one in the hospital. You have no idea what would have caused her not to go out of her way so that you could watch a football game. But what she probably needed was some gentleness. I needed you in that moment. It was a big uh-oh, yeah. I remembered a line from a Barbara Brown Taylor book. She quotes Philo of Alexandria, who said, "Be kind, because everyone you meet is fighting a great battle." We can leak gentleness. Paul reminds the Philippians, keep focused on everyone you're around and showing gentleness to them, because that's what the world needs. Now, up to this point, this isn't a bad sermon, but it's missing something. And what is missing could be summed up in one word that when I was candidating for ministry and I had to go through the board of ministry to be reviewed and the preaching committee that just tore sermons apart. They always asked the same question of every candidate after ripping a sermon apart. They would say, now where is the grace in your sermon? What keeps your sermon from becoming a bunch of oughts and shoulds on how to be good people? Where's the grace in your sermon? That's what's missing in the sermon so far. It's missing grace. It just turns gentleness into something more we have to do, something more we have to show. It's up to us. You don't even need God for it if we just put our minds to it. Isn't that what you came to church for today? So that you could have one more thing you need to do when you leave here. Where's the grace? Where's the gift? And what I realize, also from an experience I had recently, that the grace is found in the gentleness. That in practicing gentleness, we'll find grace. In August, Susan and I were part of an educational opportunities trip to Iceland and Norway. I was the Bible teacher for this trip, and it was a cruise, of course, a cruise with a lot of people, so our EO group was not all that many comparatively. But on that trip was also Pastor Rodney Frieden, who's the pastor at Epworth United Methodist Church here in Indianapolis. He and his wife and their son Riley were on the trip with members from their church. And their son Riley has Down syndrome. Well, every day that the boat went into a harbor, there were excursions you could do. So the day that we were in Malloy, Norway, we did an excursion that went to the island of Selja, where there are the remains of a monastery first built around the year 1000. That monastery was built because of a woman who became the patron saint of the Church of Norway named Sunniva. Now, Sunniva was a Christian from Ireland who came there with a group and were living on the island until a local lord came after them to run them off to kill them. They went above the shoreline, high up that rock mountain that you see where there was a cave. And they hid in the cave, but sure enough, the Lord and his army found them there and were coming up to kill them. So they prayed that God would cause the cave to collapse on them and let them die that way rather than at the hands of these others. That's what happened. And some years later, a group of sailors were coming around that island at night, and they saw a mysterious light coming from about the middle of the mountain. So they brought it to shore, they climbed up to this cave, they pulled the rocks out, and they found the body of this woman perfectly intact. They took this as a miracle, and later Christians came, they built a monastery there. That's why it's there today. So, we got there, we toured the old remains of the monastery, and then for those who were willing, they could climb up the steep, a little bit treacherous path to go up to that cave. So this next picture, I think, is one that we took looking down from the cave. So it's quite steep looking down. So Susan and I got up there. It's a beautiful day. And we were getting ready to leave when Rodney and his son Riley were just getting there. And it was hard for Riley. It was hard for him to make those steps. But he did it. He got up there. Well, when we left to go down, I could tell he was going to have a hard time getting down. So I got in front of him. I said, Riley, just put a hand on my backpack and we'll get down this together. So we would walk slowly and get down, and some of the bigger steps, I'd put my arm around him and just kind of help him down those steps. We got down to the bottom, got back on the boat, and went on about the day. I really didn't even think much of it until Rodney came up to me the next day. He said, I want to tell you something. He said, all of Riley's life, since he's been able to talk, my wife and I, every night, say, Riley, what is something you loved about today? What's the best thing that happened to you today? He said, so last night, of course, we're in the same room on the boat. Riley's in the bed next to us. We're about to turn the light off. We said, Riley, what did you love about today? He said, Pastor Rob helped me down. Man, I didn't even think about it. And here was somebody saying, you made my day. When's the last time you've heard those words? When's the last time somebody said to you, you made my day? That's a gift. That is a grace. That you can do a little something that makes somebody's day. What a gift. That's the grace. You practice gentleness, you'll find grace. Last week, we all got a leaf. And if you did not get one, I think there might be a few left. But you know what? Even if there's not one here, go pick one up. They're falling now. Get a leaf. Get a leaf. Come up and steal one from up here. You know, you can just take one of these. Pull them off. We'll get some more. Take a leaf and put it somewhere, as we talked about last week, that might represent your stress and the way you ideally would like to respond to stress. We said that's your true color. It reminds you of that. You might think of that same leaf if you got one last week and let it help you think about everybody you encounter and how you can show gentleness in that situation. What is the beauty you can bring to every encounter? Not just be neutral. Not just, well, thank you for my change. See you later. No, what can you add? What can you say? What can you give? How can you show gentleness? And then see what grace you might find as you do that. Loving God, you are a gentle Lord. You invite us to take your yoke upon ourselves, for you are gentle and lowly. That's how you treat us. You're gentle. Our world needs gentleness right now. There's so much other that seems to just fill the air. Help us to be people who live gently, who offer that kindness like the Philippians, and who stay reminded of our need to be that, so that other things don't cause us to leak even more. Fill us with that gentleness. In Christ's name, amen.